Well, over the last few weeks, we've recorded some commentary videos on Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. But this week, before we move on to Genesis 3, we've just got a little pause. And from time to time, as we go through Genesis and the Bible, we're going to do this and just talk about a specific subject. Here in the church, we have called these Excursus videos because we're taking it like a little detour and coming back. And the reason we do this is because sometimes there are just some really big questions that people have, and it's worth just focusing on them for a little while. So this week we want to just consider for a little bit this idea of why does the Bible seem to have unequal treatment of men and women in it? You know, why do men seem to be preferred or preferably treated in the Bible and above women? And we see it in culture sometimes, but you'd think that God would know better. And this is God's book, the Bible. It's the Holy Bible. You would think that if God knew that women were to be treated the same, we would see it in the Bible. So it's a question that people raise, and it's not just feminists that raise this question. You know, a lot of people have this thought, you know, why is it like that? Little girls growing up, they're wondering when they read their Bibles, you know, why do some men get advantages, it seems? Certainly in history, there's been great advances in modern society, certainly at least in the West. Thank God for that. And of course, historians, you know, they find all sorts of terrible examples of it in history. But the thing that bothers people, of course, is finding examples of it in the Bible. So we want to just take a little bit of time today and to just to think about what's actually in the Bible. We can't go into all the examples, there's way too many, but just to think about what in the Bible can help us consider this question. And there's actually some very interesting things to consider. When we go right back to, we've been going through Genesis, we've done Genesis 1 and 2, we've gone through the creation stories. You can find all our videos on the channel for that. There's a lot of things to consider, but the point that keeps getting made in the creation stories is how good creation is. God's done a good job. He goes through day 1, day 2, day 3 in the Genesis 1 story saying how good it all was. We finally get to the story of the creation of the woman, and she is described as being very good. She's the only part of the creation described as being very good. So that's an interesting little difference right there. It says in Genesis 1 that both men and women were made in God's image. And that's interesting. And we've talked at length in a different video about how in ancient times, you know, the Pharaoh or the king of a country, of a nation would consider himself to be a god. But all the regular citizens were lower than him. They weren't in God's image, so to speak. And women were even lower again. You know, that was a thing. But the Bible describes both men and women, both sexes, and every man and woman as being in God's image. There's like no hierarchy there. We're all made to reflect the Lord. That's a surprising thing. So right there in Genesis 1 and 2, we've got men and women equal. There's no hierarchy. We've got women being created and described as very good, which was, it's kind of like they're more good than the rest of creation, which was just described as good. And of course, when the woman is created second, she's taken out of Adam. She's made from his substance. You know, like man is made from the dirt. Everything else is made from the dirt, but woman is not made from the dirt. She's made out of the man, which is an interesting thing because it means she's the same as him. She's made from what he is. So women and men are made of the same thing. So all of this just highlights that the woman is special in some ways and equal in many other ways. And so we've got this right at the beginning of the Bible, and there's, I think, more thought could go into what that all means. But it's showing us God's original intent in creation. The way he set it all up at the beginning was that the unfair treatment of women was not to be a thing in the world in God's original mind. But it certainly is a thing in history, and there's examples of it in the Bible. And there are things we find in the Bible where we just see women weren't treated well. Sometimes they were kidnapped. Sometimes they were raped, murdered. There are terrible stories of things. Some of them in the book of Judges are the worst. And people who don't like God, they find these stories and they pull them out and say, see, that's in the Bible and that's why I can't follow God. But when they say that, they actually lack understanding of why stories like that are in the Bible. So it's a bit like if you were to go down to your local library and you were to pick up a book on, say, true crime stories, and you read these. That's not, you read those stories and they're interesting, but the author isn't saying, hey, everyone go out and commit these crimes. It's telling you something that's happened, but it's not saying you should be like that too. And it's certainly not saying that God endorses the behavior. Well, that's obvious in a true crime book. But in the Bible, we've got stories of what happened too. These are historical stories. Some of these stories are showing you've got to read like a bigger amount of it. You've got to read further on where you hear God actually saying to people, follow my instructions, do the things I tell you, don't do these things. And then the next thing is a story, an example of where people don't listen to God. They do the things that God said not to do. So it's an example of the types of things that happen in human society and in history when we don't follow God's design. And so, of course, and then people without understanding will point to that and say, see, God's no good. But actually, to read the whole Bible together, it's showing us that it's not supposed to be like that. And that's a very, very interesting point. We'll get to that in a minute. So in the beginning, creation is perfect. Women are equal, made in God's image, just like men. And but a thing happens in Genesis 3, and we'll be talking about this in much more detail in the next week's videos, all the Genesis 3 videos. And this is where sin enters the world. Sin is one of those words that's not well understood by a lot of people in society. Some people think of sin as like a good thing, like their sinful desire for chocolate or whatever. But sin is, or think of it very in a prudish kind of Victorian way. But sin is basically like something that's hard to describe, but it enters into creation, a bit like a virus enters into a human body. The body might be strong and healthy and fit, but next thing the body's got the Ebola virus in it, let's say. There's a terrible example. And now the body is not strong and healthy and fit, and it's going to die. So the body's still alive temporarily. So what we've got in the world is the introduction of a thing called sin. And that sin is a virus of the soul. It gets into the human soul and it changes the way we think and the way we feel and the way we act. And not only that, the Bible says that sin also affected the actual physical creation itself somehow. So we have things like predation and stuff that didn't seem to be in the original creation. Certainly things like murder and selfishness and ego and pride. And there's a lot of things that were not there in the original perfect creation, which are introduced into the, with sin being introduced, creation becomes broken. And so you try to imagine yourself without any selfishness. Imagine you're just completely selfless, but you didn't have to try to be like that. You just were like that. It was natural to you. As natural as reading a joke and laughing because it's funny, or, as natural a reaction as being happy when a baby is born, or there's things that we do that are so natural, it's almost like you don't have a control over it. And both good and bad. Well, before sin entered the world, we were naturally without these bad things. Hatred was not natural to us. Pride was not natural to us, and selfishness was not natural. So in a world like that, the way that God intended it, men are bigger and stronger, designed for a certain task. Women have more slender bodies, but designed for giving birth to children. They have a different type of body. But the two of them, free of selfishness, are able to work together and create a family and do things in the world, the jobs that God gave them in Genesis 1:28. And that would have worked perfectly if sin wasn't there. But sin did come into the world, and it is there, and it's been there through the entire of history since that moment, and has messed up a lot of things. So you have men mostly men, who've taken advantage, because men have sin in them, like everyone does, and they're physically stronger, and they take advantage of other men, but they definitely take advantage of women. And so this unfairness is a societal effect of sin. But there's also women in history who, some of them have been sneaky or clever. Some of them have been very good at manipulating social situations, and they've taken advantage of others too, men and women. So it's a sin problem, but because of men's physical strength, has more favored men taking advantage of others. Some people call this the patriarchy. I think the patriarchy is a misunderstood term, because there are times when men have been leaders and that's been okay. So that's why I'm more just talking about, why has there been unfair or unequal treatment of women? Because sometimes there's situations when men need to lead. Sometimes there are situations when women need to lead, and it's got nothing to do about either sex. It's just about what's practical and best. So sin is a virus of the soul, but it entered into creation and harmed creation and ruined it. And so what we've got in the Bible is a description of this, a description of a perfect creation, a description of creation being ruined, and then a description of what it's like in the world with the ruined creation. And there are all these various stories of things that happen, and it's not necessarily saying that's okay. And in some cases, it's very specifically saying that's not okay. And but when you also examine the Bible in a bit of detail, you start to find some surprising things. And I'll give you just this one example. There's a story in it's actually a law in the book of Leviticus, and we'll get to Leviticus in about 4 or 5 years. And if you want to see things I've already said about Leviticus on the other channel, the Peace TV channel, I've made a video for every chapter of Leviticus, and you can go through them. Very interesting. So when we get to Leviticus, at this point in the history of Israel, God's people, they've become their own nation. And so they are now getting given laws from God. Now, some people mistakenly think that these are laws for us today. But no, these were laws for the nation. It's a bit like, we've got rules like don't drive faster than 60 kilometers an hour in a built-up area. So we've got rules that are very practical. You wouldn't expect someone, a few thousand years from now living on another planet to think that rule applies to them. It doesn't. And there are a lot of laws in Leviticus that were for a country in the desert all those years ago. They're not to be looked at and say, oh, that's a law for me to be right with God now. Those were like civil laws for a long time ago. But in the book of Leviticus, you'll also find a few moral laws. There were just different types of laws, civil laws, laws of how to practice a religion, and also moral laws like the 10 Commandments. We've explained all of that in the Leviticus videos. But there's this one interesting little story about what to do in a certain type of situation. And the story goes like this. It says, if a man suspects his wife of cheating on him, he's to bring her to the priest, and the woman has to, basically get this drink. It's like a drink of water or something, and they have to sprinkle dirt from it, sprinkle it in the water, and there's a whole process of what she has to do. And she has to speak a curse over this drink, something like, if I have committed adultery, may my abdomen rot out. And then she has to drink the drink. And so she's basically drinking the curse of her words. And then if her abdomen rots out, she can then be like punished and disciplined. But if not, her husband's not allowed to divorce her. So this, when you read a story like that, you think, oh, this is terrible. The poor woman being so treated so badly. It seems pretty unfair. And I remember when I read it the first time, that's what I thought too. But a little bit more context helped me. And what I realized is, and what I've come to see is that when the Lord took these people, the early Israelites, and he wanted to start building a country out of them, a nation, the society that they lived in was so male-dominated that any man could just kill his wife, no questions asked. Or if a baby was born and it was a girl, didn't like it, just kill her. We don't want her. If it's a boy next time, we might keep that one. So there was this, like, the father in society in ancient times had like absolute power of life and death, and was clearly in that ancient historical setting a level up from women and a level up. They were both a level up from the children. And so there's this terrible example of behavior. But God comes along and God wants to change the entire world to get it back to his original plan. But it's a process. And I remember years ago, I was a school chaplain in Mount Morgan. And I was in the school there. And one of the problems in the school was that children swore, like terrible swearing. The whole school was full of it. And I remembered saying to the principal one day, the principal was a Christian, I was a Christian. The school wasn't a Christian school, it was a state school, but it was in a underprivileged area with poorer people. And so we're trying to help. And I remembered saying to the principal, should we do anything about all the swearing that's everywhere? And he said to me, with great wisdom, he said to me, one day we'll probably deal with the swearing. He said, but there are bigger things to deal with now. And he gave some examples of some things that were happening. Children that were being very inappropriate sexually in front of teachers. And there were things happening in that school that were much more serious. So you had to deal with the biggest things first, and over time you would improve things. And I imagine that if God had come out and said, here's my 150 rules or whatever number, and you all have to be like this, it would be so overwhelming, you couldn't possibly bring that change about. And in fact, we know that's true because people don't even make small changes very easily. But God brought out the book of Leviticus with his national laws for Israel, and with that story that I just told you about the woman, and what that story represents is how intelligent God is. He's dealing with a culture where men could just kill their wives if they just, and men did. If a man didn't like his wife anymore, all he had to do was say, I think you've been having adultery, and that was enough. There didn't have to be proof, just kill her. And so women lived in fear. And there's no way any woman with any brains, which would be nearly all of them, is going to have actually commit adultery because there's no contraceptive. And if she got pregnant and the guy knew it's not his, she's definitely going to get killed. Her life depends on her being faithful and loyal to this guy, and that's probably why she did so much for him. But now God comes along with his national laws for Israel and says, if you suspect your wife of adultery, you've got to take her to a third party. And that third party is going to make her speak words of curse. If I have committed adultery, speak them into a drink the drink. And then if she's did that, her abdomen would rot out. And I would say on 9,999 times out of 10,000, none of those women would have committed adultery because they knew they wouldn't have had the emotional freedom to do that. And so they're going to drink the drink. Of course, their abdomens are not going to rot out, and their life will be saved and spared. So it's an amazing story because it's the beginnings of women having some treatment that considers them. And you might say, it's not much of a beginning because she's still got to live with that terrible guy who thinks that he doesn't like her anymore. It's true. It is a terrible beginning, but it's a beginning. And as we go through the Bible, we see, first of all, we see God's original intent, ruined by sin, but then we see this process bit by bit by bit where God is speaking and changing society. We get to the New Testament, and the Pharisees actually bring a woman to Jesus and say, she has committed adultery. We caught her. We saw it with our own eyes. I always wonder why they didn't bring the guy in that story. I kind of wonder whether they were making it up. I just wonder these things. But they bring her to Jesus. Jesus is God. Jesus has got the attitude of he wants women to be treated well. But if she really did the wrong thing, and she really did deserve a punishment, like that was the law of the country at the time. So he's kind of trapped between this justice and mercy. And what Jesus says, and recorded in Gospel of John chapter 8, is like pure genius. He says, whichever one of you blokes has committed no sin, you can throw the first stone at her. And then, of course, every single one of these blokes is a sinner as well. And that's something we're definitely all equal in. We're all definitely equal in sin. And there's no one able to throw a stone. And so he says to her, don't sin anymore. In other words, you've done the wrong thing. Presumably she did. Stop doing it. But he lets her go. And see, that's the heart of God, not just to women, but to all people. If we come to him with humble hearts full of, we need his grace and we know it. His attitude is, stop your sinning. Go away and don't sin anymore. But we go away with his mercy upon us. God's amazing and he's a genius. And so we get to the New Testament and we see that. We see that Jesus he had female disciples. No other rabbis had female disciples. And so we see this process. And then we get into the modern era of living, like life that we're in now, and we notice something. We notice that the countries which are the most egalitarian are the countries with the Christian or the biblical worldview. Some people don't like me saying that, I guess, but it's just a fact. If you look at countries like Britain, England, and the United States and Canada and New Zealand and Australia, countries like this have been their foundation based on the Bible. People don't like the idea that our societies are based on the Bible, but our laws and everything are based on this solid framework of the Bible. And, people read their Bibles and they say, we need to do things better because they see it in the Bible. And another example is slavery, and we'll talk about that in the future in other videos, especially when we get to Exodus, where we see the example of God releasing all the slaves out of Egypt. But, it was Christian people reading their Bible that saw that God intended there to be no slavery. So these ideas come out of the Christian worldview. And some people don't believe me, but if you were to just to think for a minute about some parts of the world that don't have the Christian worldview. So think for a minute of like Saudi Arabia, or think of other Arab countries like Yemen, or think of North Korea. Think of communist countries. Some of those communist countries did have a Christian worldview, like Russia, but then they went away from it and had communism. And you look at those parts of the world that turned their back on the Bible view, or they never had it, and women are not treated the same as they're treated in Western countries. And so the Bible, even though it has stories of women not being treated equally, the whole story, the whole message of the Bible is that they should be. And it's something that God intended at the beginning. God sent Jesus Christ to solve the problem of sin. And the effects of it have been working out through society, making things better and better, not just for women, but for everyone. So I find it, to answer the question simply, why are women not treated equally in the Bible? And the answer, I guess the simple answer would be, was it's showing us the effects of sin, and it's showing us that it shouldn't be like that. That's the simple answer. It's not saying that, because it's there, that's what God wants. No, it's not what God wants, and it's there to teach us another way. So that's a simple answer to the question. Well, thank you for watching. If you found this thoughtful, please share it with someone else. Of course, give us a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't. May God bless you. May much grace be yours.